So national climate pledges must not only reflect the real needs of different groups, from indigenous peoples to women to young people, but must also capitalize on their strengths and expertise to ensure climate action that it's really successful. So how do we make this happen? Here with us to talk about this important topic, we have three fabulous guests. We have Mwanahamisi Singano, Director of Policy from WEDO. And we have Nicki Becker, climate communicator and activist, Jovenes por el Clima. Is that a correct pronunciation? Thank you. And Cristina, is that correct? Yes. Policy and Advocacy Coordinator, Indigenous Peoples Rights International. Terrific to have all three of you here. So, Cristina, many indigenous peoples are deeply impacted by the interconnected nature and climate crisis, because they're all, of course, interconnected. What are some of the main demands indigenous peoples have from world leaders and negotiators here at COP29, please?
Very good question. Indigenous peoples we have formed ourselves into a coalition of indigenous peoples, a caucus, and we've been following many of the negotiations here, looking at the various thematic areas. Perhaps I might just touch on three where we outline our demands. Under the issue of just transition, the rights of indigenous peoples must be upheld in all just transition agreements and actions. Just transition, climate change, green energy production must not be done in the same way as was done in the past with mining, oil and gas, drilling for coal. It cannot be business as usual, because this would not be just for indigenous peoples. We have seen the devastation of our lands and territories as indigenous peoples, and we want to make sure that no harm is done to our people. In the area of adaptation, our commitment is very clear. We want to make sure that our future generations can benefit from the same clean water, clean air, and healthy ecosystems that we currently have in our lands and territories. And so all adaptation must consider the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, the decision-making processes of indigenous peoples, and the land tenure systems of indigenous peoples. In the area of finance, we want to make sure that all financing mechanisms, whether that's for adaptation, mitigation, or for loss and damage, that it includes the designs of indigenous peoples, that it incorporates our rights enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that in fact it removes all the barriers for direct access and equitable distribution of these resources to the ground, directly to those land guardians. Those are our main demands as indigenous peoples on those three thematic areas.
Thank you for stating it so clearly. It's truly inspiring, very clear and loud statements here. Thank you. So Mishi, may I call you Mishi? Yes. Excellent. Women play crucial roles in climate action, of course, all over the world, and we see three women here, and I'm a woman. So we do see a lot of female power here at the COP. So even if we are here, we're really not fully represented on equal terms as the men here. We can see the family portrait of the COP negotiators or the representative countries. How do you find the women in that image? It's not really easy. So how can we increase the representation of women here in these negotiations, Mishi?
Yes, I think as you've said, our representation here is not equitable, and there are some of the problem, which is the UNDP problem, but most of it is also cultural problems. That's why it's cultural and national problem, and that's why for us it's really important to understand that we cannot have climate action without gender equality. So one, we need to address gender equality issue and the gender inequality issue in our own context, because if, for example, you need head of a delegation to be the head or a minister, that definitely the country that doesn't appoint women to be ministers, then they will never head it, even though we might have policy here to say we need gender equality. Or, as you've said in the family picture, there are a lot of countries that they cannot see themselves appointing women as the head of the government. And if we don't have women at the head of a government, the family picture of UNDP, it will always be majority men. So there is a direct link of the work that we need to do to address gender inequality, stereotype, biases, and structural inequality that are ingrained in the society, so that women have their position and have their space in the decision making, like in the UNDP. But also we have other problem. for those women who, for example, have already attained certain level of education, they have access to resources, and they came here, this is a complex process. So women need more support. So they need, for example, support in training. They need support in accessing finance. We have a lot of women, for example, from either civil society or the government, who keep on telling us that our government doesn't prioritize us for funding when it goes to COP. So they need to seek their own ways to find resource to mobilize to come here. And when they come here, they also need support to understand the mechanism and how that it works. So there is work, there is a lot of work and the intersection of climate and gender, and that's why we are here to address it.
So, Mishi, are you finding that there is progress here, or is it stagnant?
The progress is very slow. So, for example, the UNFCCC launched a composition report, which has shown actually there is a progress in terms of the civil society. Between last year and this is the SB, civil society has a representation of more than 50 of female delegates.
Okay.
Also, in their leadership of the NGO, there was also almost parity of 50 or 48, depending on the either it was SB or it was in the COP. But when it comes to the government, the problem still persists. We have almost 34% women. When it comes to head of delegation, number going down. So there is systematic challenges that need to be addressed, especially with the government. And I think civil society has demonstrated that if you put effort, resources, and work, we can flip the coin.
It's a lever.
Yes.
Thank you. So, Nicki, you are founder of the organization Jovenes por el Clima, and it's a leading youth movement in Argentina. And you focus on climate education and also advocacy. Impressive work you do, by the way. So, young leaders as yourself are not very well represented in these meetings. What should genuine youth inclusion look like from your perspective?
I think since 5 COPs before this one, we are seeing more young people participating and coming to COPs. But the thing is that maybe they invited us to be here, but not to have a real participation. And we don't have a real influence in what is happening inside negotiations. Our expectations in general are not fulfilled. And I think that's a problem because, for example, well, I will not talk about my country because the government from my country decided to withdraw all of our delegation last week, which is a disaster.
But you're still here.
Yeah, I'm still here, and there are a lot of Argentinians here, and we are still in. But well, talking about other delegations, it's difficult to find one youth inside the negotiation teams. And I think that's one thing that is important to improve, because if we don't have a real space there, or a real space also inside the official representation of the countries that are coming here, it's really difficult to then see the results that we want to see. So in general, maybe they think that our role is to be, organizing only protests or giving interviews, but that's not it. That's part of what we want to do, but also we want to be part of that conversation, which is the real one, and where in which we want to have an influence in.
So when before Argentina pulled out of the COP, did you have any youth delegates on the formal negotiation delegation?
No, we have never had. No.
Because I know some countries do have that. So Mishi, let's talk about the Enhanced Lima Work Program on Gender, LWPG, Gender Action Plan. Also, we talk about GAP. It's pushing countries to take gender considerations in climate action more seriously, these two entities here. What has been the progress here? We talked briefly about the progress before, but what progress and some of the challenges here from the LWPG and GAP perspective?
We are at the middle of the negotiation now for the renewed Lima Work Program on Gender. And for us, while there's a lot of challenges that need to be addressed, we do acknowledge that a lot of progress has been made, and the Lima Work Program has helped to make those progress. For example, now we have consistently Secretariat producing report on participation, so at least parties and Secretariat can see where we are lagging behind and where the efforts are needed.
It's more transparency process here. Okay.
But also we have seen mainstream mainstreaming of gender. So the gender now is not the conversation only in the gender room. We are seeing gender being mainstream in adaptation, in finance, in mitigation, and that is because within the gender action plan, we have outlined specific activities that we need to do. For example, subsidiary board need to report on the extent to which they're integrating gender on their work. So that is the progress. But also at the country level, even though the Lima Work Program did not give direct mandate for parties to have their own national work program and action plan, but some countries did find inspiration from this global action plan, and they had their own gender action plan in a country like Nigeria, Brazil, Mexico, and because of that, it really helped them now to start having to think through concrete gender climate actions, and which has helped them to unlock to work with the civil society and address specific challenges in this section of gender and climate. And overall, the Lima Work Program, if there is anything that has helped as well, is it required in the early days of the Lima Work Program to appoint the National Gender Focal Point. More than 100 women, more than 100 countries have appointed National Gender Focal Point, who are now becoming the bridge between their government or their other negotiating, agenda negotiating colleagues to advance gender, but also at their country, they have been the champions of gender climate action in their specific country. So we have seen a lot of progress, but we need to do more because the challenges are huge.
Thank you very much, Mishi. So, Cristina, Indigenous peoples have been on the front lines of climate change for many, many years, and well, actually since the first signs of the impact of climate change here. So, now many decades later, as the crisis is just getting worse and worse, what, from your perspective, what are some of the most pressing needs that needs to be addressed? You opened with the statements that you're really pushing for, but in terms of what you address that is the most pressing here, not just the perspectives, but the needs, what would you say those are?
Well, it's certainly a fact that Indigenous peoples are faced with the most profound climate impacts. Just in this year alone, we've seen extreme droughts, wildfires. We've seen now we're experiencing a phenomenon of different weather patterns that are affecting tropical areas, hurricanes, the intensity of hurricanes. And all of this has had profound impact on the lives of Indigenous peoples. One of our key messages here at COP29 is that our survival as Indigenous peoples cannot be negotiated. We cannot continue to fight over climate finance, over who's responsible. We have to recognize that lives are at stake here. And for us as Indigenous peoples, this climate impacts are real. And so I suppose one of the most pressing issues that we want to bring at the fore is really for parties to recognize and take responsibility. For those who have been feeling the highest impact and have contributed the least to the emissions, we want to make sure that our rights are at the center of every text that's being negotiated. We want to make sure that Indigenous peoples are participated, that they're included in these decision-making processes, because who else to ask what needs to be done? We have our own traditional knowledge, we have our own science, we have our own adaptations that we've already created that we can contribute to these very important dialogues and ideas. And fundamentally for us, it is absolutely critical to center all climate actions on human rights and on the Indigenous people's rights. A second pressing issue for us is where we see states conflating the rights of Indigenous peoples with local communities. No, this is a humanitarian crisis that we're facing. Humanity all over are impacted by climate. But it's important to underscore that Indigenous peoples are rights holders with very distinct ways of life. We are ecosystem dependent. We depend on nature for our lives and our livelihoods. And so any kind of climate action, for instance, the transition with energy, anything that devastates our ecosystems, anything that pollutes our waters, anything that begins to threaten our land tenure systems, continue to exacerbate our challenges as Indigenous peoples. And so for us, it's very important that we influence these policies and that it does not stay at policy level, that in fact we move to implementation. The time is now. The time to act is now. We are losing people at alarming rates because of these natural disasters. And finally, my third point in terms of pressing issues is the situation of indigenous land defenders. Our lives are sometimes the price we pay for defending our forests, our lands, our territories, in particular indigenous women who are targeted, whether that's through the expansion of protected areas where lands are being grabbed, or whether it is through projects that are being implemented, renewable energy projects even, that basically begin to then deprive and violate indigenous people's rights. We've been documenting the criminalization of indigenous peoples all around the world, and we see an increasing number of violations, even with climate action, pursuing climate actions. And so this, for us, this is really important. We are calling for all states to protect indigenous peoples' land defenders and to protect our land tenure systems.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Cristina. It's really, really important work you're doing. And we see this also we're based in Sweden, we don't have time, and we have infringement discussions on our Sami, our indigenous peoples' rights when it comes to the expansion of mines for rare minerals, and also, of course, for the construction of wind power plants, and also the water situation with the expanding. Well, that's not so much right now, but it's been talked before about the water dams. So yes. So turning back to you, Nicki, this is the final question here for this session. What are your hopes for this COP from your perspective, and are you already starting to ramp up and prepare for Brazil?
Yeah, sure. We are really happy that finally we are going to have a COP in Latin America, because of course it's a big barrier for people from my region to go to this type of events.
It's expensive,
yeah, in general it's far away from our home, but also it's more expensive, the language barrier, etc. So we are already working on that. And regarding my expectations, I think one of the most important things for my country and for my region is climate finance, definitely, which is the issue of this COP. And what I expect is that first they have an agreement of the new finance goal, and a goal that is not only the number that we want, but also not in a way of loans, but because we know that Argentina has a big history regarding loans and the external debt that we have, and we know that doesn't work for countries in the global south. So that's something that I think is important to get an agreement on, but also that that goal then that it has to be implemented, because we know that maybe if we have it just on paper, it doesn't resolve anything. So after COP, I also have a lot of expectation, and I hope to see all the agreements that we get here real implemented in real life after COP.
Well, thank you very much, Nicki. Thank you, Mishi and Cristina, for this conversation. And this is really important work you're doing. We're very grateful that you made time to come to our studio and talk about this with our viewers. We have quite a lot of people watching this, so thank you for joining and sharing your insights. Thank you very much.
Thank you.